Judy Barnett is a member of our fellowship's board of directors and the board of Paz Amigos, a local board local group that assists immigrants. Judy is Georgia born and raised. She attended nursing and anesthesia school at Georgia Baptist Hospital in Atlanta, and she graduated from Columbus State University. Judy worked in Columbus area hospitals for 38 years. Now, in addition to social and political activism, she teaches yoga, she hikes, she sails, she reads widely and enjoys time with friends, family, and her 5 granddaughters. Her topic this morning is green burial practices. Let's welcome Judy Barnett.
Thank you. Good morning. So today my talk is about changes in the death rituals and why they are changing. So you can have your body dissected, frozen, composted, dissolved, embalmed, cremated, or buried. So there are lots of choices here. This title came from an article, I think it was The Bitter Southerner, which is a literary group online, and it refers to a green burial and returning a body to the earth in a natural, environmentally correct way. This is the subject, I don't think I'd even heard of this a year ago, but as some of you know, I've had some close family and friends who passed away this past year. So I was involved in helping sisters and friends. In fact, in the best example of why you should think about this is when my friend died, her daughters called me that afternoon and said, "Do you know what Carol would have wanted?" And of course, I knew what she wanted, but this is not something that she had talked with her family about. So it's a good place to start. So just a show of hands, how many people here have already bought your funeral plot or a place to be buried? Just a show of hands, or have one that was given to you. And so that's about a third, maybe, of the congregation. How many of you thought about what you want your funerals to look like? A lot more. Good. That's good to know. And how many have you told your friends and family what your wishes are? So perfect. This, if nothing else, you are good planners and thinkers. So death practices have really changed in the last 10 years, more in the last 10 years than in the previous 100. So that's an impressive number. Burial rituals are changing too, and these changes come about by social and cultural and even political things that happen, especially in the United States. So I've been talking about this so much. My friends, and especially my daughter, has accused me of being strangely and darkly obsessed with my burial. And she may be right, because I'll say something else in the next part of the lecture. I did like the book. There's a book I like called Stiff, S-T-I-F-F, by Mary Roach, and it's all about cadavers and the people who deal with them. So it's sort of an interesting nonfiction book. And I love the TV series 6 Feet Under, if anybody watched that. It was about a family who owned a funeral home, and they were very quirky, and you got a good inside view of funeral practices. The first thing I knew was that I did not want to be embalmed. When I was a freshman in nursing school, I had to dissect a body. My anatomy class was at 11 in the morning, and when I went to lunch, that smell lingers forever. So for 6 months of that year, I could barely eat lunch because the odor just permeates everything, chemical. I also had a class when I was at Columbus State. It was taught by Jackie Titus, who most of y'all probably know. But the class was called Death and Dying. It was an excellent class. But we went to the funeral home out on Macon Road and watched part of a dissection, and that just sealed it for me, so no dissection. So I assumed I would just be cremated, which most people that I know wanted. But then I heard about the story and started researching, and I know I've reconsidered. So before we talk about green burial, let's talk a little bit about the history of funerals and burial practices. So the first known international burial site is in Israel. This dates back to 10,000 years ago. These early humans buried their dead very deliberately in caves. The remains were placed there with their garments, some trinkets, and some food. And some remains were even painted in ceremonies that would allow the gods to either protect them and or stay away if it was a god they didn't want. The Egyptians believed that the souls of the departed went to the underworld, which was beneath the earth's surface. As a result, the dead were buried in the ground so they could have easy access to their next home. They were also buried close to their families' homes so the survivors could take offerings as food and beverages. And this was thought to appease the gods and ensure that the deceased had a good afterlife. The Greeks thought that the spirit left the body as a breath of air, so they tried to get the body into the underworld. Oh, this is the wrong slide. Back. There we go. Okay. Their bodies were anointed in oil and wrapped in a shroud. And the anointed oils probably were just to show respect and to help cover odor. There was no religious tradition there was religious tradition. There was no using the oil to preserve the bodies. Before dawn, a day or two after the death, they would have a funeral procession and take the bodies to a site for burial or to a funeral pyre for release to the Olympian gods. Now we'll do the next one. A Hindu funeral takes place almost immediately at dusk or at dawn the next day, whichever comes first. No importance is placed on the body. It's just seen as a vessel for the soul. The body is anointed again, wrapped in cloth, and mantras are chanted into the deceased person's ears. Cremation is done quickly to release the souls and to help with reincarnation. For most of Eastern Asia, the religious beliefs are based on the teachings of Buddha, Joni, our best example of that. They guide those dying into a peaceful death by whispering Buddhist scripture into their ear, especially right before they die. After death, the body would be bathed and placed in a coffin with flowers and burial items, and then wait for cremation. And in Asia, white is the color of mourning, not black. So you would never wear black to a funeral in Asia. So that's just a short history. You could do a full talk on any one of these. But now we're going to talk about, in the United States, what we now call green burials were the default plan back in the 1800s. Then people were laid to rest in shrouds or handmade wooden caskets on their own family properties. A neighbor might make a coffin at the last minute, just put some wood together. enslaved people were buried in separate, unmarked plots, usually on land that was not suitable for farming. The women in the families bathed and dressed the dead and put them in the casket for viewing. And this was done in the parlor of a home. The parlor was the room that you kept clean all the time, no kids allowed. It showed their best possessions, their finest furniture, their finest lamps. And they kept it clean, like I said, in case of death. So when embalming became popular, the homes of the funeral directors were called funeral parlors, so they kept the name for parlors. So this slide shows an embalming barn. So let's see, after the Civil War started, soldiers were dying on battlefields. This was the first real change in American burial traditions. Even if the wealthy families could afford to ship their children home on a train, most of the time their bodies couldn't last long enough without decomposing. But during the same time, doctors were using arsenic to preserve specimens for study for medical students. And they decided they could embalm bodies on soldiers. So they started playing around with embalming. And then they found out they could charge families, the richer families, $100 per body to get them embalmed so they could bring them home and bury them in their family cemeteries. So during the Civil War, 600,000 soldiers were killed, and probably 40,000 of those were embalmed. Most of those were white. The black soldiers were either buried in black cemeteries near where they died or buried in a segregated section of a white cemetery. And it wasn't until 1948 that Arlington Cemetery actually integrated. It's very late. So if the Civil War gave doctors the opportunity to practice embalming, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln created the market for it. So Lincoln's party decided they wanted to take his body by train from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois. And I believe it was a 10-day train ride, may have been longer. But they sent him along several small towns and through New York in the processional on a train. And this is a picture of his train. It was the engine and the casket. I think he took his son's casket also, and maybe a car for some reason, and then the caboose. But they stopped in all these towns, and people came to view his body. When they went to see him, they were just shocked to see how lifelike he was, because I guess a lot of these people had never seen an embalmed body. They had to stop. At each stop, they had to re-embalm him because embalming doesn't last very long. I think at the most 5 to 7 days. So it's not a permanent thing. And they not just put embalming fluid in the body, they put dyes that would make their color better, which is why sometimes people look better at the funeral home because they've done their hair, their nails, and they put the right color to bring the rosy cheeks back. And one of the articles I read while I was researching this said Americans liked the way this embalming looked, and they called it Disneyfication of the dead body, like Sleeping Beauty. She would just look like she was peacefully sleeping. And the interesting thing to me is the United States is the only country that really embraced embalming. Other countries don't, so it's pretty much a U.S. thing. So since that time, the U.S. funeral industry is now a $20 billion per year industry. And that's because we pay morticians, funeral directors, casket manufacturers, and cemeteries. And this said, if you die in America in this century, chances are you're going to be embalmed in a traditional funeral home. And that preserves your body for a few days. Maybe too much information, but during embalming, they have to take away all your blood. And they empty all your organs, sometimes remove things. And after the blood is removed, they put in that fluid, which is like pickling almost. So from 1850 to 1960, 95% of Americans were embalmed. That's huge. In 110 years, 95%. Jewish and Muslim religious beliefs forbid embalming, and those people that's why they're usually buried within 24 hours. So in 1960, Jessica Mitford, wrote a book called The American Way of Death. And she encouraged cremations, and she criticized all the expenses and funeral rituals that involved mortuaries and funeral homes. And her book actually changed a lot of people's minds. Many people think that September 11th, 2001 was when another change started. After the searching for bodies, after the Twin Towers and the airplane crash and the Pentagon, 40% of the victims were left accounted for, so they only found 60% of the bodies that could be used for burial. And Americans seemed to, after that, let go of the need to have a body to grieve, which I thought was sort of interesting. But what did become a thing was memorial sites. That was really the first time the public celebrated a life by doing memorials. And people used flags, candles, pictures. People started giving blood to commemorate someone dying. And at this time, in the next 15 years, the cremation rate doubled from 5% to 10%. Cremation now accounts for 56% of all Americans. And it was 5% in 1970 and 56% now. And the prediction is by 2035, 80% will be cremated. That's could change. But there are three reasons more people wanted to be cremated. First of all was the cost. Average funeral is over $10,000 compared to maybe $1,500 for a cremation. And that $10,000, I've seen people spend $10,000 just on the coffin if you buy a fancy casket. The second reason people like cremation is environmentally. Conventional funeral means embalming, usually using formaldehyde. The person's placed in a casket, often made of hardwood or steel or another metal, and it's lowered into a concrete or steel grave liner. And that vault that they're lowered into is a legal requirement because it keeps the embalming fluid from leaking into the groundwater. So you can't be buried just in a casket in a regular graveyard without a vault. The surroundings in these graveyards are kept green by using pesticides and fertilizers. There are 1.5 million burials per year in this country. So that means thousands of tons of copper, bronze, and steel. 1.5 million tons of concrete for vaults. 800,000 gallons of embalming fluid. And 30 million board feet of hardwood just for caskets. These elements are there for good. I mean, a metal vault in the ground is still going to be there 100 years from now. Also, if funeral workers are exposed to too much formaldehyde, they have a higher risk of leukemia, brain, and colon cancer. So it's dangerous to the people who actually work with those fluids. And then the third reason people are moving away from burials and to cremation is because people are more unchurched than they used to be. Americans aren't as connected to religious institutions, so that leads them away from cemeteries. In 2021, only 47% of people admitted to belonging to a church, synagogue, or a mosque. And that's compared, 1999, it was 70%. So that's dropped almost 20 points, 23 points. Younger Americans in particular are not tied to churches where their grandparents and parents may have had a service. So more young people are having a secular service or a celebration of life. Some people just have parties, friends get together. But cremation's not that good for the environment either. Petroleum has to be used to burn the furnaces, and that puts carbon monoxide and soot into the air. Even mercury emissions from dental fillings is a concern for the environment, something I had not thought about either. There is a cleaner alternative, which is somewhat like cremation, and it's called alkaloid hydrolysis. And this is water cremation. I was not familiar with this either. This uses potassium hydroxide, heat, and pressure, and it decomposes the body in 2 to 3 hours. The University of Florida had used this in the 90s to dispose of cadavers that were donated after they were studied. 20 states have now legalized this. So if you ask about it, it's called water cremation. Georgia and Florida are both. It's legal in both the states. Okay. So your ashes can also be buried with a tree seed mixed into the ashes. Or some people are just having a tree planted on top of their ashes. The ashes, though, don't help fertilize the soil because they're sterile. All the germs, all the microbes are gone after cremation. Okay, so this is, we start to talk about green burial. So green burial isn't really new. It's just the way people were buried before they started embalming. A green burial would just be another funeral back in the 80s. And the funerals, the person was kept in the home, in the parlor, until the burial, and then that was a processional to the church. Usually then the coffin would just be a pine box, which is biodegradable too. A green funeral simply means there's no embalming and the body is buried in a biodegradable manner. There are 2 reasons people have started thinking about green funerals. First is the earth-friendly mindset. More people are worried about the environment. Returning to nature, do no harm. And cemeteries can be turned into forests and meadows. The second reason is, of course, cost. You don't want to cause too much of a financial impact on your loved ones. The cost of an eco-friendly funeral vary, but they tend to be lower than the average. Okay, so in Georgia, there are 3 green cemeteries. One is near LaGrange, one is just north of Atlanta in Milton, and the third is in Conyers. That's the Milton Fields. And this is Honey Creek Woodlands, close to Conyers. Some traditional cemeteries now have areas where you can have green burials also. And in these, you can be buried in a coffin, a shroud, or just have your ashes buried in a biodegradable container. So this is biodegradable, beautiful. You can be buried in any kind of woven, wicker, rattan. You can actually order a cardboard kit ready to assemble online, and it just comes shipped flat, because shipping's the huge cost for all these things. This one is cardboard, you put it together. Hopefully not yourself, but you can just keep it packed up in your attic. This is an example of just a pine box, and this is something else. This is a shroud, and the shrouds, some people choose not to have a coffin at all, and they're just wrapped. This is a very ancient and a tradition with lots of history. When you are buried, everything that's put in has to be biodegradable. There are no monuments, so when you look out over a field, there's a flat stone, usually with your name and date. The graves are 3 feet deep, not as deep as you have to have with a coffin. They start decomposing in about 3 weeks, and after 5 years, only large bones are remaining. And I said caskets can be wood, no nails. You have to use pegs to put the wood together. It can be any kind of woven material, nothing treated, or cardboard. The shrouds have to be cotton or linen. I saw a beautiful picture at one of the places I visited, and the person was wrapped in a quilt, an antique quilt. It was just beautiful. But it has to not have polyester inside. It has to be all cotton. Almost done here. These are the stones that were shown at one of the homes. Always interested. And these stones have to come from the property. So this property had a lot of, I don't know what those are, shale maybe? But it's near a granite uprising, so it could be granite. You can find the burial plot, though, by getting your GPS coordinates from the cemetery manager. And there's usually just a stake with a metal tag that tells your coordinates so your family can find you. So another change in our rituals came with COVID. We all knew people who were dying during COVID. The numbers of people dying were on the TV screens every day, the totals. And a lot of us started to think about death more than we had before. There could be no gatherings for funerals. We started looking for new ways to commemorate our loved ones. Funerals became more individualistic. And a lot of people I know who didn't get to have a funeral thought they would do it later. But then the pandemic kept coming and it took so long. And most of the people that I heard say this, they were sort of over their grieving and mourning and thought their process was done. So a lot of people didn't ever have a funeral. Okay, people are getting tattoos where the ashes are mixed into the ink. It's apparently a thing. There were a couple of questions about legality and safety. The ashes are sterile, so you can put them in the ink. Not a lot of people tattoo artists like to do it because if they weren't handled correctly, maybe you could get an infection. Other people made cremation jewelry or other objects out of the ashes, and then they gave them out to people. Okay, this might be my favorite slide. Ellen Harlan sent this to me, and she said, you can use this in your talk, which I thought, that's another way to remember your loved ones. Just go to family game night every week. So ultimately, I decided to buy a plot at Honey Creek, which is the place near Conyers. There's the monastery of the Holy Spirit is there. And I'd been to this site. It's sort of near where my family is from. My daughter lives about 10 miles from here. And it's a beautiful monastery. It originally had about 70 monks. And as they have aged out and gotten older, there are only 7 left, and only 2 that are still young enough to do any kind of work. And they mostly travel and talk now. So what they did, they used to run a bakery. And they also had gardens, so they would sell their produce and sell their bread. That's when I had been there before. I went there to buy bread years ago. All that's closed now. The monastery is still beautiful. I have a picture. But in order to make money, they took part of their preserved land and got permission to have the cemetery. And there's 100 acres there. It's protected. 1,000 acres. And 70 of those are for burial. They have woods. You can choose to be buried in the woods or in a meadow. That's the picture of the monastery. It's beautiful. Rick thinks those are pecan trees, he said, maybe. And so once you're buried there, this is in the pine forest. There's a creek that runs behind there. So you're buried, and then the dirt is mounded up to allow for it to settle. And at this cemetery, you cannot use silk flowers, artificial flowers. You put only natural flowers. You can plant a tree. Everything planted has to be of this habitat. It has to be, what's that called? Native, thank you. So, and then you can put your stone on there. So, like I said, I bought my plot there. The plot I picked has a creek running behind it, and this land looks very familiar because I hike all the time. I picked this because it's so beautiful, and I'm so happy when I'm hiking. There is a meadowland, which was beautiful, but there was no shade, and that just seemed like it would be too hot. So I picked a place in the forest, and that is actually my plot with the yellow black on it. And so when I said, my daughter thinks I'm dark, I decided I would make myself a shroud, and you can get a pattern online. I made it out of some linen that I had bought years ago and never used, so I thought, perfect. I put a ruffle around the top edge, and I actually, when I was deciding how to make this, I put it out on the floor, and I made my husband wrap me like you do a baby so I could make sure everything was wrapped and tucked. So if my daughter thinks I'm dark, if she could have seen that, she would have died. So anyway, that's the end of my talk. The only thing I would say is talk to your family, make some plans. It's very hard to plan for things when you're grieving and you've lost somebody. So I'm open to questions, and I hope I can answer some of them. Good.